Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It's Friday, July the 3rd. Just one more day until the big celebration, the 250th anniversary of the American Republic, July the 4th, 1776. And when one thinks of the last 250 years of American history, one could argue that the decisive moment wasn't so much the War of Independence, but the Louisiana Purchase that happened a few years after independence. And as it happens today, there's a new book out on the Louisiana Purchase by my guest, Alexander Mikaberidze, who is a professor of history at LSU and is joining us today from Freeport, Louisiana, where he lives. Alex, happy Independence Day. It's tomorrow. You're originally from Georgia. How are you going to celebrate Georgia in the Caucasus rather than Georgia in America? How are you going to celebrate Independence Day tomorrow?
Well, first of all, happy Independence Day, and thank you so much for having me on your wonderful show. And I do it traditional, kind of all-American way: hot dogs and burgers, and getting together with friends and discussing kind of how fortunate, really, in many ways we are to be here. I've been in the United States for 26 years, almost 26 years, and this has been quite a journey. And everything I have is really because of the wonderful people of this country that I now call home.
I'm not American, Alex, but I'm thanking you on behalf of the American nation. Your new book, which is published by Oxford University Press, has the subtitle, The Grand Bargain and the Making of America. Could one indeed argue that it is the critical moment in the creation of the United States? And had it not happened, you certainly wouldn't be there, because you'd probably be living in Spain or France or some independent Latin American, Central American state. And the history of America or the United States would have been entirely different.
Absolutely. Certainly Oxford University thinks so, because it has a series called Pivotal Moments of American History, and for which this book has been written, and have been spent last almost 6 years now working on it. I certainly believe that it is one of the most important moments, not just in American history, but in fact, I would say in world history. And there are so many different ways you can approach this claim, right? It certainly was an event that over the next or subsequent decades and generations reshaped the American imagination and really stirred the ideas of the uniqueness of American experiment. The Monroe Doctrine, for example, if nothing else, that came out just shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, is clearly rooted in the discussions that began in Louisiana Purchase. But
we'll get to the Monroe Doctrine in a few minutes. But one of the things that I think surprises people who aren't experts on this is when one thinks of the Louisiana Purchase, of course, one thinks, well, the U.S. purchased Louisiana from the French. But when one looks at the map, it's the entire Midwest. I mean, it's about a third of the continent of the United States. Give us some numbers, Alex, on the size of the purchase in terms of the acquisition price and the size of the land that the United States actually acquired.
So let me kind of divide my answer in two ways. One is what ultimately we agree as historians and maybe as decision makers agreed upon what the extent of the territory that is acquired. And today, we kind of the number that we all accept is 828,000 square miles, which is about 530 million acres of territory. But at the height of American claims, as in 1803 to about 1806, United States actually claimed almost 1.3 million acres of land, which is far larger than kind of the 530 million that we ultimately talked about. Hold on. Can I repeat myself, or is it?
No, you're allowed to repeat yourself
All right.
on the show. Did you make a mistake?
Yeah, I think what I said is 1.3 million acres when it's 1.3 million square miles, as opposed to 828,000 square miles. So that's
coming back to the map. I mean,
yeah.
Maybe I put you on the spot in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge amount of land. I mean, even today, when we look at it, it's the heart of the United States. It includes all of Oklahoma, Kansas, both Dakotas, much of Montana, Wyoming, Iowa. It's an astonishing. It's astonishing amount of land.
It's 13 states, to be precise, that ultimately kind of were formed from it. But the reason I'm talking about discrepancies because one of the fascinating things about Louisiana Purchase is that when it was negotiated and signed, ultimately it was not, the borders were not specified. And it took United States another 16 years of prolonged negotiations and arm twisting to actually settle the boundaries. And so as part of that discussion and debate over what exactly we acquired in 1803, for example, one of the hot topics was whether Texas was included. In fact, if you look at the earlier maps of Louisiana, or at least how France envisioned Louisiana territory, the border ran on Rio Grande, so that would have been.
It could have even been bigger. Well, it's bigger now. So let's remind ourselves: in 1803, America, the original American states had successfully revolted against the British, but much of the rest of North America, or what we think of now as the United States, was not under the control of these original states. Who were the big players? It was Spain and France, of course.
Spain, France, and Britain. These are really the power brokers in North America, with Britain after 1763 controlling all of what is today Canada, plus Florida, which Britain will eventually lose in 1783 as in the wake of American Revolutionary War. Spain, meanwhile, controls, after 1763, everything that is west of Mississippi, so from the river to the Pacific Ocean. So it's an enormous swath of territory.
Well, which, of course, now is California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona.
And France, when it
and Texas, of course,
that absolutely, and France, when it finally kind of forces Spain to relinquish the control of the former French Louisiana, then we have the prospect of the French restoration of the French control, and it is actually that prospect that really prompts the United States to accelerate the prospect of, or they accelerate its diplomacy to acquire the territory, because the fear in the United States was that instead of the quiet neighbors, many American diplomats at the time were referring to Spain, you're going to have an aggressive and powerful imperial state of the sorts of Napoleonic France. And it is that negotiations, the Franco-Spanish negotiations of 1801 to 1802, that spurs the Americans to find a way to get at least the city of New Orleans, if not a huge, significant chunk of Louisiana territory.
And of course, New Orleans being the port city that's still the major city in Louisiana and one of the great cities, not just in North America, but in the world. You're an academic expert, Alex, on Napoleon Bonaparte. How central is he in the Louisiana Purchase? Is he the main player, certainly outside the United States?
So the way I approach this book is slightly maybe different from previous. Of course, the Louisiana Purchase has been extensively written about. So what I wanted to do is look at the long kind of view of history, what the French call longue durée, and I can understand why Louisiana repeatedly has been given away or attempted to be given away. And when I look kind of from that perspective, kind of looking at 200 plus years of history, then what I realize is that in many ways Napoleon, for all his genius and kind of military and political acumen, well, he's in many ways victim of the circumstances that he can't control. He's facing the structural developments, that's long-term developments that really contributed to his ultimate decision to relinquish Louisiana. And what I mean by this is that over the previous 200 years, you have consistent themes of the imperial rivalries that divert France's and Spain's attention away from Louisiana. For both French and Spanish empires, Louisiana is the least profitable and therefore least interesting colony. There's very little in terms of infrastructure development, little of investment, little of developing the very things that would make this territory appealing. So when Napoleon comes around in 1799 and seizes power, and then starts kind of rebuilding the French colonial power, he envisions French Empire being rebuilt in the Western Hemisphere, but it would be centered on the Caribbean colonies.
Which, of course, were more valuable for their slave owning or their slave-based economies.
Absolutely. In places like Saint-Domingue, what is today Haiti, or Martinique or Guadeloupe and St. Lucia, that are producing profit margins that is simply inconceivable. If you look at the map of Saint-Domingue, the French part of it, the French part of the island of Hispaniola, what is today Haiti, that third of an island was producing 40% of the world's sugar and almost 60% of coffee. And so
I take that point. So what was the independent of geopolitics, which I want to come to in a minute, where was the value of the land that the French controlled in what we now think of as the Midwest, in the center of the United States?
So that's one of the issues I kind of try to pick apart in the book and point out that France controlled only a few outposts along the Mississippi River and have virtually no understanding of what is out in what we call Midwest. And in the outposts, the way the outpost is fortified, the lines of forts and line up on the Mississippi, it's clearly designed as a barrier to contain the English/British expansion, and both expansion in terms of territory, political influence, but more crucially, commerce. And so from the very beginning, when La Salle sails down Mississippi in 1682, and then when Louisiana is officially formed, the idea here is this territory as a strategic barrier that will be used to choke off the British competition. And so the climate, the geography, I don't know if you've been to Louisiana, especially in the summertime.
I have several times, and I'm actually happy I'm in San Francisco.
Exactly. I was about to say that
it's hot there, Alex, is it?
I just came back from New Orleans, and I bet I would give anything to be in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, you're more than welcome to come here. So, I mean, excuse the vulgarity of this question, but did the French have the right to sell this land? You note that it was a series of outposts along the Mississippi. What gave the French the right to this land?
So that's a very important question that I took kind of head on because I think one of the best ways to grapple with Louisiana is to confront this myth that exists for a long time that surrounded this topic, and that is the myth that United States overnight doubled its size, that we bought the land. We actually did not buy the land as such, and anyone willing to spend time reading Jefferson's or Gallatin's, if this is Treasury Secretary, or any founding fathers documents from 1790s forward, we'll actually get a very good sense of what United States was determined to acquire. And this is two things. One, they do know that the France has, or Spain too, effective control of particular areas. So, for example, New Orleans is a big city. It's garrisoned. The European powers, whether France or Spain, has effective control of it. So there you can talk about the purchase of the territory and the infrastructure. But in the rest of the territory, which is enormous, as we have seen, what we talk about is the right of preemption. In fact, there is a fascinating meeting in February of 1793 in Washington, D.C. No, actually, no, it's not in Washington, D.C. I think that it's a meeting of the Washington's cabinet. I don't remember whether it was meeting in the city or not. But it's a cabinet meeting, and Jefferson was cautioning President Washington against making territorial claims beyond what were the officially recognized international borders of the American Republic. And the reason why he was doing a kind of cautioning is because he understood that the United States cannot simply negotiate with France or Britain or Spain and claim the land, because there was an inherent understanding, and this is a Vatelian international law, that recognized the native indigenous right to sovereignty. And so in that meeting, Jefferson specifically talks about what he says is right of preemption of the Indian lands. And what he means is that in negotiations with French or Spanish or the British, the United States should focus on claiming the right from to negotiate directly with native population. So, and that's what the Louisiana Purchase really was. So the vast territory that we acquired, we actually claimed the right of preemption. France, in exchange for the payment that we offered, agreed to give up its claims in regard to the native land.
So this gives the Louisiana Purchase a very different kind of dimension. Most people think that for $15 million, America acquired the entire Midwest, but you're suggesting all they really acquired for this money was the right to negotiate with Native Americans, the tribes, relations between the original states and these peoples. Is that fair? Absolutely right.
In fact, we know what the United States did after 1803. It developed a special system, right? U.S. Indian Treaty System, which ultimately will include well over 200 separate sessions. And these are the direct negotiations that the United States undertook with the native nations in order to acquire land. So what we can therefore talk is that there is not a single Louisiana Purchase, but rather Louisiana Purchase that consists of hundreds of transactions after 1803 that collectively allowed the United States to claim the territory that we discussed. And that actually is important because another myth that surrounds Louisiana Purchase is this convenient reference to $15 million that supposedly went to purchase of the land. So once again, it didn't. But even there, the price can be spliced. It's kind of split in different ways. First of all, the $15 million includes the several million dollars that went to cover the claims to the property damages that Americans posed against the French. So that should be excluded. But more crucially, that price does not encompass all those 220 plus treaties of cessions that the United States ultimately negotiated with native nations. And if you collectively kind of look at what it cost us to acquire the land, and when I'm talking about the right to the land, right? So then as of 2026, that will be well over $12 billion. So, and that's times.
So the way that the deal's normally presented to lay people, Alex, you know this better than I do, is that the US got a great deal and the French gave away something of massive value. What you're suggesting is, in a way, the French did a pretty good deal. They didn't really control the land. And secondly, all they gave up was the right to negotiate with the native people. So Bonaparte was commercially a cannier fellow than he sometimes presented. Is that fair?
I certainly try to point that out because in spring of 1803, in April to be precise, there is an interesting meeting. It's in Saint-Cloud, which is a small town that had a palace on the outskirts of Paris. And the meeting is attended by Napoleon, as well as his Minister of the Marine and Colonies, Admiral Denis Decrès, and the Treasury Minister, Francois Barbin-Marbois. And it's a crucial meeting because it is the meeting that effectively decides the future of this North American French colonial empire. So it's April 10 to be precise. And at this meeting, Napoleon essentially looks over the strategic picture, and he points out that France is struggling in Saint-Domingue, that France is about to face an all-out war against Britain, that France's fleet is in desperate need of repairs and expansion. In fact, I've looked at the French archives, and there's a fascinating report from that spring of 1803 from April that says that the effective strength of the French naval power at the time was just 22 ships of the line, which is a pittance considering that British Royal Navy had at least 4 times that many numbers deployed. And so effectively, Napoleon understands the scale of the problem is staggering. So he's willing to make a very important political decision, that is to give up on Louisiana territory, because he understands it will empower American Republic to be a counterbalance to the British on the other side.
And in terms of all this strategic stuff, how concerned were the British? Did they try and involve themselves in this purchase? I mean, obviously they'd just been defeated in the Revolutionary War, but how serious was their interest both in the purchase itself and in the land that was theoretically being acquired?
So the British actually were looking at this as choosing the lesser of the two evils. And the bigger evil for them is the prospect of Napoleonic colonial empire being revived in the Western Hemisphere, centered on the Caribbean, but with a significant presence in Louisiana. And from that perspective, they were perfectly willing to actually stay neutral in this transaction if the territory went over to the United States. In many ways, the British looked at the American Revolutionary War not necessarily as a total defeat, but rather they looked at it as a yes, we lost the colonies, but we factually, in terms of commercial, financial relationship, were more than able to make up the losses. And it was in there, from the point of view of Hawkesbury, for example, the Prime Minister and others, it was perfectly fine if the United States acquired that territory, because ultimately their goal at the time was to weaken.
And what about, given that the British controlled Canada, what about the British's concern about the purchase in terms of their Canadian provinces?
They don't have as of a clear concern about possible, let's say, American expansion to Canada. Of course, that will later on be attempted during the War of 1812, and as we know, American invasions were unsuccessful. So the British are not as concerned about that. In fact, again, they are more concerned about the revival of the French colonial enterprise in the Western Hemisphere. They're concerned about, for example, news that Napoleon is preparing to send 4,000 or so troops to New Orleans, and what those troops will do to displace the British interest across the Louisiana territory, including into the Great Lakes region. That's a greater concern. And Napoleon understands that. And so what he was worried is that if the war begins, that he will not be able to protect the port of New Orleans from the British attack. And so he's willing to give it away. But, and this is where that meeting at St. Cloud becomes so interesting, is because he actually solicits opinions from Decrès, the Minister of the Colonies and the Navy, and from the Treasury Minister. And the two men are diametrically opposite in terms of approaching this problem. Decrès, for example, argues that colonies need to be protected at all costs, that the France will be able to safeguard its interest, and it kind of Decree looks at colonies as the crucial element of the French revival. Barbé Marbois, the treasury minister who actually spent some time in North America, is of completely opposite opinion. He says we need to get rid of it as soon as possible. Louisiana territory has been nothing but drain on our resources. And so ultimately Napoleon agrees with that. And at the end of the meeting, he makes this famous response that he's decided to give it away. He famously says, "I renounce Louisiana." But what he's offering is, he says, "I'm willing to sell it for as low as 50 million francs." Now, 50 million is an interesting number because it's far lower than we actually paid for the rights of preemption, right? And what he says here, 50 million, is for the rights of preemption. But when Barbé Marbois meets the Americans, he actually, as a savvy businessman, and he actually highballs Americans and tells them, Bonaparte is not willing to sell for anything less than 120 million. And it is later, through haggling, he slowly reduces it to 100 million, then 80 million, and so on.
So in terms of this haggling from the American side, you've mentioned Jefferson several times already in this conversation. Who were the key American negotiators and visionaries of this deal? Jefferson is often credited with imagining the role of this new territory in a United States. Is he still the key figure from the US's point of view?
Oh, as a president, certainly he is the key figure, and he sends a series of very interesting instructions that outline American position. But we should not forget that there are other very important figures involved, not the least State Secretary Madison, as well as the two American ambassadors, so an ambassador and an extraordinary envoy. Our ambassador to Paris is Robert Livingston, who is, again, among the very kind of interesting individuals of the first generation of the American forefathers, very, very prominent statesman from New York. And of course, he is assisted in the spring of 1803, although if you ask Livingston, he would say that he kind of screwed things up.
But was Jefferson, I take your point on all these other characters, but was Jefferson, should we credit Jefferson with the vision of understanding the importance of this? He's often credited with it, not necessarily by specialist historians like yourself, but by generalists who see Jefferson as the key figure in the founding of the Republic.
Of course, he's, in that sense, he's a crucial figure. But again, I would caution against giving him too much credit because Jefferson is concerned, for example, until summer of 1803, he's very concerned about the constitutionality of everything that he's doing with regards to territorial acquisition. And that is actually one of the very important lessons of the Louisiana Purchase. It unleashes a constitutional crisis over the presidential power. So in 1803, Jefferson is conducting a foreign policy that is not explicitly described or sanctioned by the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution does not give the explicit power to U.S. president to conduct anything of this sort. And so that the whole debate about where the president's authority ends, what can the U.S. president do or not do, that is the debate that is engendered by the Louisiana Purchase.
Right. And that, of course, is not the first or the last time that there has been a debate about the powers of the presidency, especially when it comes to foreign policy. I know that both Federalists and Jeffersonians were concerned over, as you note, the Purchase's constitutionality. Who was most concerned? Was it the Federalists?
I would say that Jefferson himself is very concerned. In fact, so concerned that in July of 1803, he prepares 2 constitutional amendments in order to deal with this issue of legality. So Jefferson is absolutely worried about it, as so is the Attorney General of the United States, Lincoln, and others, members of the cabinet. But the Federalists, I think one of the interesting things that makes, I think, the Louisiana Purchase in many ways relevant to our own discussion is the political theater that surrounds the Louisiana Purchase. Because here, in the debate surrounding Louisiana Purchase, we see the two quote unquote parties, right? You know, the Republican Democrats and the Federalists, they flipped their positions. So Federalists during the previous two administrations were staunch proponents of central authority, federal government, and so on and so on. Here in Louisiana Purchase, they actually denounce Louisiana Purchase because it was it would inevitably strengthen the federal government. And then the opposite is true for the Jeffersonians. The very people who were keen advocates of the state rights, including Jefferson, now become the great proponents of the expansion of federal government to unprecedented levels. One of the things we should consider, for example, what was of great worry for the contemporaries was what would happen to the citizens or people living in the territories the United States acquired. Let's say an American citizen who left Boston or Philadelphia and crossed the Mississippi and went and settled in the newly carved out territories. Would he or she be still exercising their full rights? Would they be still citizens? Let's not forget that, for example, Louisiana did not become a state until 1812. So if you were an American citizen and went to Louisiana Territory, you would effectively be in a limbo because you would be living in a territory that was governed by officials directly appointed by U.S. president with no recourse to elections.
Yeah, there is certainly a colonial quality. And of course, the great question on this, Alex, is the impact on Native Americans. Many of them, of course, died, some directly as a consequence of this acquisition, some as a consequence of disease. Was the impact on the Native Americans of the Louisiana Purchase, was it as catastrophic as many people suggest?
Yes, it was in many ways. So from Jefferson's point of view, when the negotiations began, the negotiations were about acquiring specific parts. That includes New Orleans, and effectively includes these portions of the Mississippi that were crucial as a commercial artery that allowed much of the western states to ship their goods out. Now, Jefferson, once he realized what Livingston and Monroe negotiated, he also understood how kind of utilitarian and how useful this would be as a way of emptying territories east of Mississippi of the native population. So in his correspondence, both cabinet meetings and notes, as well as the personal correspondence, Jefferson repeatedly outlined the plan where the native population living east of Mississippi would be forced to relocate to this quote-unquote vast wilderness west of Mississippi. And of course, that is what leads to the Trail of Tears in Jacksonian era. But of course, the subsequent expansion of America west of Mississippi also has a devastating impact on the native polities, on the native way of life, on native societies.
How aware were the native peoples, their leaders, their diplomats, their political leaders in this purchase? How aware were they both in terms of being informed by the parties and simply just being aware of what was happening?
No, they're not informed of kind of in formal ways, or they're not aware of this transaction that's taking place on the other side of the Atlantic. Nor are they invited to this formal transfer ceremonies that take place in New Orleans and St. Louis in the late 1803 and the spring of 1804. But in subsequent negotiations, the United States repeatedly raises this question of the rights of preemption that are based in the Louisiana Purchase. So it's in later kind of negotiations that the leaders of the indigenous nations that effectively discover what has transpired. And of course, from their point of view, this is a gross violation of
right. So as you know, that they weren't very happy about this, to put it mildly.
But I do want to mention again that the American statesmen, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and everyone else absolutely understand that the that the natives have the sovereignty over of this land. That is why they are so keen on securing the right to preemption. That is why they are so keen on negotiating. And in fact, only later on in the book, I point out that the United States Supreme Court repeatedly actually ruled in favor of the native sovereignty of the land. And the most famous of these decisions were in 1828, for example, in American Insurance versus Cantor, in which the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the United States government possessed the power to acquire territory because of the kind of war-making and treaty-making authority, but the territory actually belonged to the native.
So in a way, Alex, America comes out of this looking even worse in the sense that they knew exactly what they were doing. And then, of course, later developments, you've already mentioned Jackson, Vale of Tears, and all the rest of it. So in a way, this casts an even gloomier, darker picture of this purchase in terms of the fate of Native Americans.
I would say so. Well, I think one way to look at it is that the fact that the United States actually was willing to recognize the legal principle of the native sovereignty and agency, and engaged in negotiating the Treaty of Secession. Of course, how those treaties were negotiated is a separate topic. But I would also point out that Supreme Court, as I noted, in Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, or in Worcester against Georgia in 1832, consistently rules in favor of, again, legality of the sovereign right to land. I think the dark spots here are things like Andrew Jackson's refusal to enforce the Supreme Court's decisions, because that would have constrained the American expansion. So yes, I think there are certain aspects of it that I think we can look upon as making the United States look worse than traditionally is accepted.
And what about the issue of slavery, of course, which many people consider the original sin, or alongside the treatment of Native American peoples, the original sin of America? Thomas Jefferson, of course, is very much associated with this original sin as a slave owner himself. Was there slavery in these French territories before this acquisition?
Yes. In fact, there is a very interesting kind of dynamic when we talk about slavery, which I try to address in the book, and that is there are different modes of kind of slavery, so to speak. So, for example, French system of slavery was far more rigid than the Spanish, and the Code Noir that the French introduced in 1720s in Louisiana significantly restricted the interracial relations. The Spanish approach was far more lenient. In fact, Spain allowed multiple different venues for the enslaved people to acquire their freedom, and in fact, one of the kind of legal principles of Spain, for example, was known for is the principle of coartation, that allowed the enslaved individuals to buy themselves out, and the Spanish legal system recognized, and because it derives its principles from the Roman law, it recognized the individuality, or if maybe not humanity, of the slaves, and so it allows them certain rights and prerogatives, including the right, for example, to represent themselves or to launch the legal proceedings against the owners. And we have repeatedly such instances. When the United States acquired Louisiana territory, it effectively acquired from Spain. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning this is that France negotiated the acquisition with Spain for 2 years between 1801 to 1803, but the French authority here barely lasted just a few months, if actually days, I would say. Formally, the United States, France acquires Louisiana territory only in November of 1803, and then gives it up in December of 1804. or three. So it's really the Spanish legal system. It's the Spanish institutions that the United States acquired. And in comparison to Spanish institutions dealing with slavery, American system was far more rigid. And that is one of the legacies of Louisiana Territory, and that is expansion of slave trade, expansion of the number of slaves introduced to Louisiana Territory, but more crucially changing what the social economic status of slaves. Now, Jefferson himself has long been champion of this vision of America as an agrarian republic. He famously talks about the United States as the empire of liberty. And what he wants is to kind of essentially help the United States acquire this territory and kind of create a land of free, independent yeoman farmers. And he believes that by facilitating this process, he will help the slavery wither away. And that kind of historians later spoke about this theory of diffusion, that the more United States would spread, and you have kind of this stretching of American fabric, that slavery will, as long as the transatlantic slave trade was closed, slavery will disappear. This Louisiana Purchase actually creates a completely opposite reality, because the acquisition of this very fertile and territory in Mississippi Basin that is very conducive to the plantation-style economy. It actually increased the rationale for slave trade. So for many people don't realize this, but in spring of 1803, South Carolina actually banned slave trade, and it was on its way to kind of dealing with the issue of slavery. And it is Louisiana Purchase that prompts this South Carolina and other states to unban slave trade as a way of making money by transporting slaves to the acquired territory.
Alex, the subtitle of your book is The Grand Bargain and the Making of America. Maybe you're missing a word. Maybe it should be the Grand Faustian Bargain and the Making of America, the deal with the devil. You mentioned, especially when it comes to slavery and, of course, relations with the native peoples, you mentioned at the beginning the impact on the Monroe Doctrine. What was the relationship between the Louisiana Purchase and this development of the Monroe Doctrine, America's sense of itself in terms of the rest of the continent?
I argue that it is a foundational moment. Effectively, what happens in the wake of Louisiana Purchase is that the United States understands that it's becoming a continental power. Right? You have a Lewis and Clark expedition, which, by the way, for your listeners, there's a wonderful new book by Craig Furman on the vast enterprise that kind of reassesses Lewis and Clark's expedition. But in Lewis and Clark and other expeditions that followed, it kind of gave the United States a better understanding that it's a continental power, that it has nothing to fear from the South. And in fact, that's, again, as I said, Jefferson spoke of Spanish Empire as a quiet neighbor, as a docile neighbor. That's another quote. And that,
well, these were the Spanish in Florida, of course.
Spanish in Florida, Spanish in Texas, or out in the West. From American point of view, Spain is a very good neighbor because it is a weak neighbor. And already, for example, in 1789, there's an interesting book that is published by Jedediah Morse, who wrote kind of this study of geography and all. And Jedediah Morse in 1789 speaks about the need of American expansion into the Spanish territory. And he famously says that this is not merely a vision of fancy, but rather this is a precondition for what he calls, in fact, he writes it in capital letters, American Empire. And he envisions this western boundary of American Empire being all the way in the Pacific, right? And so what Louisiana Purchase did is effectively made these ideas, these visions of the people like Jedediah Morse a reality. And of the subsequent decade, more and more Americans came around to envisioning an empire. And again, this is a term that's not that is actually used by contemporaries. Almost every letter I've read discussing Louisiana Purchase in the wake of the purchase talked about the creation of, quote unquote, of an empire, whether it's an empire of liberty of Jeffersonian's vision, or just an empire in the traditional sense that many Americans statesmen believed was the only way American Republic can survive in this hostile world of the great powers. And the Monroe Doctrine is a direct result of such ideas and discussions.
Yeah, so maybe the subtitle should be The Grand Faustian Bargain and the Making of the American Empire. Finally, Alex, you've been very generous with your time, and tomorrow is the big day. I'm sure you're eager to prepare all those hot dogs and all your fireworks for tomorrow. Could we imagine a world where the Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened? What would it be like? I know it's a rather childish question, but could you imagine that world? I'm sure you've given it some thought in terms of this book.
I actually don't think it is a childish question, to quote you. I actually think those kind of questions are very important to consider the contingency of history. And that's one of the things I always talk with my students about, to emphasize the complexity, but also contingency of history, how things might have developed. So, for example, one of the contingencies is what might have happened if Bonaparte had sanctioned an expedition of those roughly 4,000 French troops, veteran troops, to a port of New Orleans in 1802. The expedition was preparing. It was ready to sail in October of 1802, and the bad weather delayed its departure, and then it was too late. So what might have happened if those troops actually arrived here? Now, my argument is that if the troops arrived, and that's actually would have been a massive deployment of French power, the largest deployment of the French power since the American Revolutionary War, right? So that might have encouraged Napoleon to retain effective control of southern portions of Louisiana Territory, and more crucially, the subsequent history, especially during the War of 1812, shows us that the native resistance had a chance of succeeding against American expansion if it was supported by a great power. So I'm referring, for example, Tecumseh's famous resistance against the United States with the support of Britain. Now, what I can envision, for example, a scenario of having a French garrison, a sizable garrison down in New Orleans, and France, that historically had a very close relationship with native nations, kind of cultivating that relationship in order to maintain presence deep inland, and essentially leveraging it as a way of constraining American expansion. So then the question is, what American Republic would have looked like without access to the hinterland, without the resources that we have kind of utilized to really become a superpower of the in the 20th century? And that is a very interesting question. I still believe that parts of United States would have developed and would have become economically vibrant, certainly in the northeast, in New England area. But American Republic certainly would not have acquired the status, the global status that it did, without the continental reach, the safety, the resources that Louisiana Purchase pushed it towards.
In other words, on July 4th, rather than hot dogs, maybe the peoples of Kansas and Oklahoma and Dakotas, Nebraska would be celebrating with croissant.
Or tacos and moles.
Oh, yeah, probably even more tacos and moles. Well, Alex, wonderful conversation. The book is out today, appropriately enough, the day before July 4th. It's The Louisiana Purchase, The Grand Bargain, and the Making of America, not the first or the last book about the purchase, but as it's published by Oxford University Press, one of the more credible and important. You've spent 6 years on it. So congratulations, Alex.
Thank you so much.
And happy Independence Day. Have a lot of fun with your hot dogs and fireworks tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Happy Independence Day.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.